This was the scene when emergency services arrived at the home of Chris and Lisa. They had called 911 after their 4-year-old son had been impaled by a metal stake while playing in the garden. The child was in such a bad way that he didn't even make it to the ambulance. Sadly, doctors were unable to save him, and he passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. What an absolute tragedy. But before we move on, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Let's get right into it. Chris and Lisa were in their early 30s, and they lived in a nice house in the suburbs with their 2 children, little Ethan and his baby sister, Emma. One Saturday morning, the couple decided to take their kids out for the day. So they loaded up the car and headed off to the local water park. The whole family had a great time that day, and the kids splashed around in the pools and rode the water slides until their heart's content. When it was time to go home, Ethan refused to leave the water park. He started throwing tantrums and screaming at the top of his lungs, but his parents eventually convinced him to come along, and they all got back in the car. When they arrived home, Chris and Lisa let Ethan and Emma out of their car and watched as they ran off to their favorite spot in the garden, the treehouse. It was a small wooden structure that was built around the base of a large oak tree. The kids loved playing in there, and it was always decorated with drawings and paintings that they had made. Chris and Lisa sat down on some nearby chairs to watch their kids play. They sipped on some iced tea and basked in the warm evening sun. At first, everything was going well, and the kids were having fun climbing up the treehouse ladder and jumping off the balcony. After a few minutes, though, Ethan came down the ladder and went over to a patch of grass near the treehouse. He picked up something from the ground and walked back over to the structure. At first, Chris and Lisa couldn't see what Ethan was holding in his hands, but then they noticed that it was a long metal stake that was usually used to hold down tarps and other materials. Ethan brought the stake up to the opening of the treehouse and plunged it into the gap between the wall and the roof. He pulled it out again and held it up for his sister and parents to see, a wild look on his face. Then he did it again, plunging the stake into the opening and pulling it back out. At this point, Chris and Lisa started shouting at their son, telling him to get away from the treehouse and to stay away from the sharp object. But Ethan didn't listen. Instead, he climbed up onto the balcony and dangled his legs over the edge. He continued to plunge the stake into the gap between the wall and the roof, seemingly enjoying himself. As Chris and Lisa watched in horror, they saw the wind catch one of Ethan's shirts and pull it over the edge of the treehouse. The wind was strong that evening, and the shirt was quickly sucked over the balcony and onto the ground below. Unbeknownst to Ethan, the stake that he was holding was also sucked over the edge by the wind. He lost his grip on the object, and it fell over the balcony. But luckily, it didn't fall very far. The stake landed in the grass on the other side of the treehouse, but it was still extremely dangerous, and it was still extremely sharp. But Ethan didn't notice any of this. He crawled over to the edge of the balcony and leaned over as far as he could. He looked down at the ground and saw the stake lying in the grass. Without thinking, he reached down and tried to grab it, but it was too far away and he couldn't reach it. In a panic, he pushed his upper body over the edge of the balcony and tried to grab the stake. But just as he grabbed it, his arm and the stake were pulled over the edge by the wind. He desperately tried to pull himself back onto the balcony, but it was no use. He was being pulled over the edge. Lisa and Chris screamed in horror as they watched their son disappear over the edge of the balcony. They ran over to the treehouse and frantically tried to climb up onto the balcony, but it was too late. They heard a sickening thud as Ethan's body hit the ground. They climbed down the ladder and ran over to where Ethan had fallen. They found him lying in the grass with the stake sticking out of his chest. Blood was pouring out of the wound, and he wasn't breathing. In a panic, Chris and Lisa called 911 and tried to perform first aid on their son. But when emergency services arrived, there was nothing they could do. Ethan had lost so much blood that he had already passed away. The paramedics tried to resuscitate him, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. His parents were taken away in an ambulance to the hospital where they could be treated for shock, and the stake was removed from Ethan's body and placed into an evidence bag. At the hospital, the doctors gave Chris and Lisa some medication to help them cope with the shock and the pain. They stayed in the hospital for a few days, but they were too distraught to eat or sleep. All they could think about was their dead son. When they returned home, they were met with even more tragedy. Someone had left a bouquet of flowers and a card on their doorstep. The card read, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I hope Ethan has a wonderful afterlife. Love, the Jones family." Chris and Lisa were confused. They didn't know anyone called the Jones family, and they hadn't told anyone about their son's death yet. Then they checked their security cameras, and that's when they realized that someone had hacked into their system and changed the passwords. They went through the footage, and that's when they saw the horrifying moment that Ethan was impaled by the stake. They watched as their son's body was pulled over the edge of the balcony, and they listened to the sickening thud as he hit the ground. Chris and Lisa were devastated. They couldn't believe that someone would hack into their security system and change the passwords just to watch their footage. But then they remembered that the stake that had impaled Ethan had come from their neighbor's yard. The stake had been part of a tarp that had been covering up some construction materials. The neighbors had been renovating their house for months, and they had been storing the materials in their backyard. Chris and Lisa confronted their neighbors, but the couple denied knowing anything about the stake or the security camera footage. They claimed that they had nothing to do with Ethan's death and that they were just as shocked and saddened as Chris and Lisa were. But the police weren't so sure. They searched the neighbor's house and they found a number of items that belonged to Ethan. They also found a number of disturbing images on their computers that showed them watching Ethan play in the yard. It soon became clear that the neighbors were responsible for Ethan's death. They had set up the stake in their yard in order to kill Ethan. They had chosen him at random, and they had hacked into the security system to monitor him as he played. The couple was arrested and charged with murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In an interview with the police, they confessed to killing Ethan. They said that they had been planning to kill someone for months, and they had chosen Ethan because he was the first child that they had seen playing in the yard. They said that they had no remorse for what they had done and that they were willing to do it again. Chris and Lisa were never able to come to terms with the fact that their son had been killed by their neighbors. They moved away from the house as soon as they could, and they changed their phone numbers and email addresses. They even went to court to try and get the death penalty for their neighbors. But the judge ruled that the neighbors should serve life sentences instead. What are your thoughts on this case? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. See you next time.